Prisons are designed around routine. Every movement, every sound, every moment of silence is expected, recorded, and repeated day after day. Guards walk the same routes, cameras watch the same corridors, locks click shut at the same hours with the same confidence, reinforcing the belief that control is absolute. An escape does not begin with running. It begins when that routine fails quietly, without alarms, without panic, without anyone noticing that something is already wrong. In the early hours before dawn, when night staff operate on muscle memory and exhaustion dulls suspicion, a maximum security facility prepared for its final head count. The inmate at the center of this story had been accounted for hours earlier, his name checked off a list that had not changed in years. He was known as compliant, quiet, and unremarkable, the kind of prisoner officers rarely remembered beyond a cell number. That anonymity would become his greatest weapon. He had studied the prison not as a place of punishment, but as a system. He learned which guards rushed their rounds, which cameras were repaired quickly, and which stayed broken for weeks. He noticed how maintenance requests moved slowly through bureaucracy and how minor issues were ignored if they did not disrupt daily operations. A loose vent screw, a faulty motion sensor, a storage door that required a code no one bothered to change. None of it seemed important alone. The escape itself did not involve dramatic violence or confrontation. There were no hostages, no alarms triggered in panic. It unfolded in pieces, each step relying on the assumption that someone else was paying attention. When the inmate left his cell, it was during a window so brief it barely existed on the official schedule. A guard was distracted by a radio call. A camera was pointed a few degrees too far left. The prison did what it always did. It trusted itself. By the time the absence was discovered, the escape was already hours old. A routine count flagged the empty cell. At first, officers assumed a clerical error, a transfer misrecorded, a late-night medical movement not logged correctly. Only when supervisors checked footage did the truth begin to form, slow and unsettling. A prisoner had walked out of a secured area without resistance, without detection, and without leaving behind any obvious trace. The response was immediate but uneven. Internal lockdown procedures activated, sealing sections of the facility that no longer mattered. Search teams swept corridors that had already been cleared hours earlier. Prison leadership notified local law enforcement, careful with their wording, reluctant to admit the scope of the failure. The phrase possible escape was used instead of confirmation, buying time while uncertainty lingered. Outside the prison walls, the world remained unaware. Traffic moved along nearby roads, houses sat dark and quiet, no sirens sounded, no alerts were issued. That delay would later become one of the most criticized decisions of the entire case. Officials feared panic, they feared scrutiny. Most of all, they feared admitting that a system designed to contain had quietly failed. The escaped inmate moved with purpose, but not urgency. He understood that chaos would come later. For now, invisibility mattered more than speed. He avoided main roads, stayed within terrain he had studied through secondhand accounts and smuggled maps. He knew that the first hours after an escape were the most dangerous, not because of police presence, but because of unpredictability. He needed distance before attention arrived. When the public announcement finally came, it was restrained and technical. Authorities described the individual as dangerous, yet provided few details. Roadblocks were established too late to be effective. Helicopters searched areas based on outdated assumptions. Meanwhile, the escape dominated internal briefings. How had this happened? Who had missed what? Which safeguards had existed only on paper? As news spread, pressure mounted quickly. Media outlets demanded answers, politicians requested briefings, families living near the prison questioned why they had not been warned sooner. The escape was no longer just a security issue, it had become a public failure, unfolding in real time. Investigators reconstructed the timeline obsessively. Every camera frame, every door log, every radio transmission. They identified dozens of small decisions that combined created opportunity. None alone justified discipline. Together, they revealed complacency. The prison had not been breached, it had been outgrown by its own confidence. The manhunt expanded outward in widening circles. Local police coordinated with state units, federal agencies were alerted, old associates of the escapee were interviewed, vehicles were monitored, financial activity flagged. The system shifted suddenly from containment to pursuit, adapting to a problem it was never designed to handle smoothly. What troubled investigators most was how ordinary the escape looked in retrospect. No genius-level planning, no cinematic brilliance, just patience, observation, and the ability to exploit a structure that believed it could not fail. This was not an escape that exposed a single flaw, it exposed a mindset. As dawn broke and search teams pushed further into surrounding regions, a realization settled among those leading the operation. Catching the escapee would not undo what had already happened. The real damage was not the man who had left the prison, it was the certainty that others might learn from how easily he did. And as the manhunt began in earnest, the question was no longer whether he would be found, it was how far he could go before the system corrected itself. By the time the sun rose fully over the surrounding countryside, the escape had transformed from an internal crisis into a public emergency. Law enforcement agencies that normally operated within clear boundaries were now forced into rapid coordination, their jurisdictions overlapping in ways that rarely happened without months of planning. Patrol officers, detectives, state police units, and federal task forces were pulled into briefings that carried the same uneasy tone. This was no longer about procedure, it was about recovering control. The first problem investigators faced was uncertainty. They did not know how the escapee had left the prison grounds, only that he had. Footage showed him disappearing into a blind zone near a service corridor, an area long known to staff but dismissed as low risk. Beyond that point, there were only assumptions. Did he steal a vehicle? Did someone meet him? Did he remain close? Or had he already crossed county lines? Every answer led to a different deployment strategy, and choosing wrong meant losing time that could not be recovered. Initial roadblocks were erected based on the most conservative estimates of distance. Officers stopped vehicles, checked identification, and scanned faces for someone they had never seen in person. Most checks were quick, almost apologetic. Many officers privately doubted the escapee would be foolish enough to use major roads so soon. Still, protocol demanded visibility. The public needed to see that something was being done. Behind the scenes, analysts worked through the escapee's history in detail. His criminal record, previous residences, known associates, and behavioral patterns were laid out on briefing room walls. Unlike impulsive escape attempts, this one suggested patience and planning. That realization shifted the tone of the hunt. This was not a desperate man running blindly. This was someone who understood systems, routines, and human behavior. Search teams moved methodically through nearby wooded areas, abandoned structures, and service tunnels. Dogs were brought in, but the trail faded quickly, either intentionally disrupted or overwhelmed by foot traffic near the prison. Helicopters scanned from above, their presence loud and visible, yet limited by terrain and weather. Every hour that passed without contact increased the likelihood that the escapee had already reached a place where he could blend in. Public communication became a delicate balance. Authorities released a photograph taken years earlier, aware that it might already be outdated. They described the escapee as dangerous, though internally they debated how accurate that label was. The language mattered. Too alarming and panic would spread. Too restrained and the public might not take precautions seriously. The statements were cautious, rehearsed, and intentionally vague. Media pressure intensified quickly. Reporters asked how a high-security facility could lose an inmate without immediate detection. Officials responded with phrases like ongoing investigation and review of procedures, careful not to assign blame prematurely. Inside the command center, frustration grew. Every question felt like an accusation. Every delay felt like confirmation of failure. As the manhunt widened, investigators began exploring the possibility of assistance. Phone records were examined for unusual activity in the days leading up to the escape. Financial analysts flagged dormant accounts for sudden movement. Visits to the prison were reviewed, looking for patterns that might suggest coordination. The escapees' behavior inside the facility was re-examined, moments of compliance reinterpreted as preparation. One lead emerged from an unlikely source. A maintenance contractor reported noticing someone matching the escapee's description near a service road several miles from the prison early that morning. The sighting was vague and unconfirmed, but it shifted the search perimeter outward. Patrols were redirected, surveillance teams repositioned. The hunt adapted, though uncertainty remained. Meanwhile, tension spread through communities near the prison. Schools adjusted schedules, businesses closed earlier than usual, residents locked doors that were rarely locked before. Some expressed anger at authorities for the delay in notification. Others expressed fear, fueled by speculation and incomplete information. Social media amplified every rumor, forcing officials to respond not just to facts, but to narratives forming faster than they could correct them. Internally, the escape triggered a parallel investigation. Prison administrators were interviewed, shift logs scrutinized, equipment maintenance records reviewed line by line. The goal was not yet accountability, but understanding. How many opportunities had been missed? How many safeguards existed only in theory? Each discovery added weight to an already heavy situation. As night approached again, the manhunt entered its most dangerous phase. Darkness offered cover, but also confusion. Officers worked long shifts, fatigue setting in. Decisions became harder. The possibility that the escapee might attempt theft, confrontation, or further travel increased with each passing hour. Commanders emphasized caution, reminding teams that desperation could change behavior unpredictably. Despite the intensity of the search, there were moments of unsettling quiet. No confirmed sightings, no alarms, no confrontations. The escapee remained absent, defined only by the space he had left behind. For investigators, that absence was unsettling. It suggested control, it suggested planning, it suggested that the hunt was following, not leading. By the end of the second day, the manhunt had crossed into multiple jurisdictions. Coordination meetings grew larger, more complex. Responsibility blurred. Each agency brought its own procedures, priorities, and expectations. The challenge was no longer just to find one man, it was to prevent the system itself from fracturing under pressure. As night settled once more, one reality became clear. The escape had already achieved something lasting. It had exposed how quickly certainty could dissolve when assumptions failed. The prison had lost control within minutes. The manhunt struggled to regain it days later. And somewhere beyond the expanding perimeter, the escapee continued moving through a world that now felt both vast and fragile. The hunt was on, but whether it was gaining ground remained uncertain. By the third day, the manhunt had settled into a rhythm that investigators both relied on and feared. Leads came in steadily, but few held weight. Sightings were reported at gas stations, bus terminals, rural roads, and city edges, each one triggering brief surges of activity before dissolving into uncertainty. The escapee had become less a person and more a shape moving through imagination, defined by what he might do rather than what he had actually done. Analysts shifted focus from geography to behavior. Instead of asking where he was, they asked how he thought. The escape had not been impulsive. It suggested patience, planning, and an understanding of institutional blind spots. That insight narrowed the list of possibilities. He was unlikely to seek shelter with close family immediately. He would avoid places tied directly to his past. He would move toward environments where anonymity was natural, not forced. Transportation hubs became areas of renewed interest. Surveillance footage from bus depots and train stations was reviewed frame by frame, not just for facial recognition, but for posture, gait, and habits. Investigators looked for someone moving with intent but not urgency, someone blending in by acting ordinary rather than hiding. Clothing descriptions were broadened, time frames expanded. Every detail mattered, even those that seemed insignificant at first glance. Pressure mounted within command centers. Resources were being consumed rapidly. Overtime budgets ballooned. Agencies not accustomed to long-term joint operations struggled with coordination. Differences in communication styles, decision-making authority, and operational priorities created friction. Meetings grew longer, decisions slowed. The urgency remained, but clarity suffered. Public patience wore thin as well. Daily briefings offered few updates. Officials repeated the same assurances, careful not to reveal strategies. The absence of progress fueled speculation. Some questioned whether the escapee had already crossed borders. Others suggested inside assistance that extended beyond the prison itself. Trust, already fragile, strained further. Behind the scenes, investigators made a critical breakthrough not through technology, but through routine analysis. A financial analyst noticed a minor transaction flagged automatically by a system designed to catch irregular activity. A small purchase, made in cash, then supplemented by a prepaid card. The location was unremarkable, a roadside convenience store near a long-distance bus route. Alone, the transaction meant nothing. In context, it stood out. Security footage from the store showed a man who matched the escapee's general description, though the image was unclear. He moved calmly, avoided direct eye contact, and purchased items consistent with travel, not survival. The timestamp placed him far beyond the initial search perimeter, confirming what some had feared. He was not hiding, he was moving. The manhunt recalibrated instantly. Regional task forces were notified. Transportation routes were mapped forward instead of backward. Investigators focused on where he could be going, not where he had been. The possibility of crossing into another state or even another country became real. Jurisdictional coordination intensified, accompanied by new layers of complexity. As attention shifted outward, scrutiny turned inward once more. How had the escapee maintained such a lead? What assumptions had slowed the response? The early delay in public notification came under renewed criticism. Some investigators argued that an earlier alert might have limited his options. Others believed it would have caused panic without preventing movement. The debate was unresolved, but the consequences were now visible. Field officers felt the strain acutely. Long shifts blurred together. Every interaction with the public carried tension. Tips poured in, many well-intentioned, most unhelpful. Officers learned to listen patiently, knowing that dismissing even unlikely information risked missing the one detail that mattered. Fatigue made judgment harder. Pressure made mistakes more likely. Meanwhile, the escapee's world narrowed in ways he could not fully control. Every mile increased risk. Every interaction left traces. Even careful planning could not eliminate chance. Cameras existed in places no one expected. Witnesses noticed small things. Systems overlapped imperfectly, but enough to create friction. The freedom he had gained came with constant calculation. Investigators began anticipating his needs: food, shelter, transportation, communication. Each requirement presented opportunity for detection. They monitored public terminals discreetly, avoiding heavy presence that might drive him away. Plainclothes officers replaced uniforms. Surveillance became quieter, more patient. The first credible sighting since the convenience store came from a transit worker who noticed a man lingering near a ticket counter without purchasing. The behavior was subtle, but it matched analytical predictions. Surveillance confirmed the resemblance. Within minutes, teams repositioned. Routes were covered. The hunt shifted from broad to precise. Yet even as the net tightened, uncertainty remained. Was this the same man? Was he aware of the attention closing in? Would he adapt again? The escape had already demonstrated his ability to exploit gaps. Underestimating him now would be costly. As night fell on the third day, the manhunt entered a critical phase. The escapee was no longer an abstraction. He was a presence moving through monitored spaces, leaving faint traces but detectable. Investigators felt closer, but also more exposed. One misstep could send him disappearing again, possibly forever. The pursuit had become a test of systems as much as individuals. Technology against patience, coordination against improvisation. The question was no longer whether the escape had exposed weaknesses. It was whether those weaknesses could be corrected in time to matter. Somewhere ahead, the escapee made decisions of his own, unaware of how close the pursuit had come. The margin for error on both sides had narrowed. The next move would change everything. By the fourth day, the manhunt had shifted from expansion to compression. Investigators were no longer casting wide nets across maps and jurisdictions. Instead, they were folding space inward, narrowing possibilities, and accepting a difficult truth. The escapee had not survived this Mong by luck alone. He was adapting, adjusting his pace, and exploiting the same human assumptions that had allowed him to leave prison unnoticed. Catching him would require discipline as much as speed. The confirmed sightings from the previous night triggered a reorganization of command. A smaller, centralized decision group replaced the sprawling coordination calls that had slowed response times. Information flow was streamlined. Leads were triaged aggressively. Anything without corroboration was logged and set aside. The hunt no longer had room for noise. Surveillance teams focused on transit corridors rather than destinations. Investigators understood that the escapee's goal was not comfort, but movement. Staying ahead mattered more than hiding well. Bus routes, regional trains, and informal ride-sharing hubs became priority zones. Officers dressed as commuters. Plainclothes teams rotated frequently to avoid recognizable patterns. Visibility was reduced deliberately, trading intimidation for patience. One of the most difficult challenges was resisting pressure to act prematurely. Political leaders demanded results. Media coverage intensified, dissecting every decision in real time. There were calls for aggressive sweeps, mass stops, and public alerts that would saturate the area. Commanders resisted. They knew that overt pressure would push the escapee into riskier behavior, increasing the chance of violence or permanent disappearance. Instead, they focused on predictive behavior. Analysts revisited everything known about the escapee's past, not just criminal history, but personal habits, how he responded to stress, how he planned under constraint, how he handled waiting. This psychological profile suggested he would avoid dramatic moves. He would choose efficiency over boldness. That insight narrowed likely routes further. A breakthrough came from an overlooked source. A municipal worker reported finding discarded clothing near a drainage access point close to a commuter rail line. The items were unremarkable, cheap, easily replaceable, but their placement suggested intentional shedding rather than carelessness. Investigators recognized the tactic immediately. He was altering his appearance gradually, minimizing attention rather than reinventing himself overnight. Forensic teams recovered fibers and traces, confirming the clothing had been worn recently. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras showed a figure entering the area late at night and leaving shortly after, wearing different outer layers. The image was unclear, but the timing aligned perfectly with other movements tracked earlier. The net tightened another degree. As teams repositioned, tension rose among officers in the field. Everyone understood how fragile the situation was. A single mistake could trigger flight, confrontation, or public danger. Firearms remained holstered. Arrest protocols were reviewed repeatedly. The priority was capture without escalation, a goal easier stated than achieved after days of pursuit. The escapee, meanwhile, was operating under increasing constraint. Every decision now carried weight. His margin for error was shrinking, though he could not measure it precisely. He sensed attention indirectly, conversations cut short, spaces that felt watched without obvious reason. The quiet confidence that had sustained him began to erode, replaced by calculation bordering on fatigue. Investigators anticipated this psychological shift. Stress changes behavior. People rush, they repeat patterns, they take shortcuts. The team watched for signs of impatience, missed connections, loitering, deviations from earlier discipline. The hunt became as much about waiting as moving. Late that afternoon, transit surveillance flagged a familiar posture at a regional platform, a man standing slightly apart from others, eyes scanning without focusing, body angled toward exits. He did not check his phone, he did not sit, he waited. Facial recognition could not confirm identity, but behavior matched the profile closely enough to justify escalation. Plainclothes officers moved subtly into position. No sirens, no radios raised. Uniformed presence remained distant. The plan was containment, not confrontation. If he moved, they would move with him. If he waited, they would wait longer. Minutes stretched. The man boarded a train. Surveillance confirmed his seat location. Officers boarded at separate cars. The train departed. Commanders debated whether to act immediately or allow further confirmation. The risk of misidentification loomed large. A public mistake now would undo days of careful work. As the train slowed approaching the next station, the decision was made. Officers moved simultaneously, controlled and calm. They identified themselves quietly. The man froze. There was no resistance, no sudden movement, just a long exhale that carried exhaustion more than fear. The arrest was swift, almost anticlimactic. Passengers noticed something was happening, but there was no panic, no spectacle. The escapee was escorted off the train without incident. His hands were secured. His expression remained neutral, though his eyes betrayed recognition. He knew the run was over. Confirmation followed quickly. Fingerprints matched, identity verified. After days of uncertainty, the system closed its grip. The manhunt ended not with force, but with containment, the same principle that had failed initially, now restored under pressure. As news broke, relief swept through command centers, but it was tempered by reflection. Catching the escapee did not erase the vulnerabilities exposed. Investigators began documenting lessons immediately, knowing that scrutiny would follow. Every decision would be questioned, every delay examined. The escapee was returned to custody under layers of security that bordered on symbolic. Extra restraints, redundant escorts, protocols enforced with near-theatrical precision. The system was proving, to itself as much as the public, that it had learned something. Yet beneath the relief lay an uncomfortable truth. The manhunt succeeded not because the system was flawless, but because it adapted under failure. The escape had revealed gaps that could not be unseen. Procedures that once felt sufficient now felt fragile. As night fell and operations wound down, the atmosphere shifted from urgency to reckoning. Reports would be written, reforms proposed, careers scrutinized. The capture marked an end, but also a beginning. The final scene would not focus on the escapee at all, but on the institutions forced to confront how close they had come to losing control entirely. The end of the manhunt did not bring closure so much as it opened a new chapter of scrutiny. In the hours following the escapee's recapture, attention shifted away from the man himself and toward the system that had allowed him to disappear in the first place. What had begun as a story of pursuit now became an examination of accountability, where every decision made before, during, and after the escape was pulled into the light. Internal reviews began immediately. Timeline reconstructions were ordered down to the minute. Who noticed what, when they noticed it, and why action was delayed. Surveillance logs were audited, shift rosters examined, maintenance reports resurfaced. Procedures that had once existed as routine paperwork were now treated as evidence. Each document carried weight, not because it proved intent, but because it revealed patterns of neglect. The escape route itself became a focal point. Engineers and security specialists walked it step by step, identifying points where alarms failed, cameras lacked coverage, or oversight depended too heavily on human attention. None of the failures alone explained the escape. Together, they formed a chain of small oversights that had aligned at exactly the wrong moment. Investigators referred to it quietly as a convergence, a reminder that systems rarely fail loudly, they fail softly over time. Public reaction intensified as details emerged. Media coverage shifted tone from suspense to criticism. Headlines questioned funding priorities, staffing levels, and training standards. Commentators debated whether the escape was an anomaly or a symptom of deeper institutional decay. Trust, already fragile in matters of incarceration and justice, eroded further. Families of victims connected to the escapee spoke publicly, some expressing relief, others anger that safety had depended on chance rather than certainty. Their voices reframed the narrative. This was no longer an abstract failure of protocol. It was a breach that carried emotional and psychological consequences beyond the prison walls. Officials responded with promises of reform. Task forces were announced, independent audits commissioned. Language grew careful, emphasizing transparency and accountability. Yet behind closed doors, conversations were less polished. There were disagreements over responsibility. Some blamed understaffing, others cited outdated infrastructure. A few pointed to complacency born from years without incident. Disciplinary actions followed, measured but visible. Supervisors were reassigned, policies rewritten, mandatory retraining introduced. While no single individual was publicly blamed for the escape, the message was clear. The institution would not treat this as an unavoidable fluke. The appearance of accountability mattered almost as much as the substance. The escapee himself faded from public view. He was transferred to a higher security facility under conditions that bordered on isolation. Movement was restricted, monitoring intensified. His story, once dominant, became secondary. He was now evidence rather than subject, referenced in reports rather than headlines. Yet the psychological impact of the escape lingered among staff. Officers questioned routines they had followed for years without incident. Confidence in systems was shaken, vigilance increased, but so did fatigue. The awareness that failure could come from familiarity rather than malice changed how many approached their work. Experts weighed in with broader implications. Prison escapes, they argued, were not merely security lapses, they were stress tests, rare, dramatic events that exposed how institutions functioned under pressure. The lessons extended beyond prisons, touching law enforcement, emergency response, and public safety infrastructure as a whole. Policymakers debated funding. Some called for technological upgrades, others emphasized staffing ratios and training. A few warned against reactionary measures that prioritized optics over effectiveness. The challenge lay in addressing real weaknesses without creating new ones through haste. In the months that followed, reforms took shape slowly. New surveillance systems were installed, redundant checks implemented, communication protocols revised to reduce hesitation during critical moments. These changes were incremental, almost invisible to the public, but significant within the system. The escape became a case study taught quietly in training sessions, not dramatized, not sensationalized, presented instead as a sequence of decisions, assumptions, and missed opportunities. Trainees were encouraged to see it not as a failure of individuals, but as a reminder of how vigilance erodes when success becomes routine. For the public, memory of the manhunt faded as attention moved on. New stories replaced old ones. Yet beneath the surface, its influence persisted. Procedures changed, awareness sharpened. The system bore the imprint of its moment of vulnerability. In retrospect, the most unsettling aspect of the escape was not how far the man had gone, but how briefly the system had lost him. That small window of absence revealed how fragile control could be, how dependent safety was on layers working in quiet coordination. The manhunt ended without violence, without spectacle. That outcome was considered a success. But the true measure lay elsewhere, in whether the lessons learned would endure once urgency faded, whether reforms would be maintained when memory softened. The escape had exposed a truth institutions rarely confront willingly, that security is not a fixed state, but an ongoing process, vulnerable to complacency. The pursuit that followed restored order, but it also forced reflection on the cost of assuming order would always hold. As the final reports were filed and the last temporary measures removed, the story settled into history, not as a tale of daring freedom, but as a reminder. Systems fail not when they are tested, but when they believe they will not be tested again. And somewhere within reinforced walls, the escapee remained confined, no longer a symbol of failure or fear, but a silent catalyst for change. The hunt was over. The consequences were not.